We're good to go.
Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for day 2 of the GEO Indigenous Summit 2020. And this is our session on food security. We have a great lineup of speakers for you today, and I will be moderating this session. My name is Catherine Nakalembe. I'm an assistant research professor at the University of Maryland, and I'm a part of the GEO community, particularly interested in agriculture and food security. So I'm really excited for today's sessions. There's a lot of learning that I'll be doing myself. Just briefly, I support the GEOGLAM initiative, which is GEO's global agriculture monitoring initiative, and our work really focuses on increasing market transparency, improving food security by providing and disseminating relevant, timely, actionable information on agricultural commodities, outlooks for national, regional, and global scales, and we achieve this by strengthening the international community's capacity to utilize coordinated, comprehensive, and sustained satellite Earth observations data. Please do use slido.com. That's slido.com to post questions to our speakers today. And the code for our session is GEO Indigenous Summit. It's one word. And straight away, so we can get in and start learning today, I would like to introduce our first speaker. His name is Titus Leptapo. He's a co-founder of the GEO Indigenous Alliance and the managing director of the Sarara Foundation. He's a member of the Samburu tribe in Kenya, and he's joining us in northern Kenya today. So we'll just watch a quick video, and please don't forget to post questions in Slido that you might have for Titus as we begin.
Good evening, good morning, everybody. As I said earlier, or maybe on the first day, that my name is Titus Letapo, and I work for Sarara Foundation, which is a Kenyan-based non-profit organization that support the communities, the indigenous communities in northern part of Kenya, specifically in Samburu. So I'll take this opportunity to maybe talk about food security, food and nutrition security within the indigenous people of Samburu County. Samburu people live in Samburu County in Rift Valley region. It borders Baringo in southwest, Marsabit County in the northeast, Turkana County in the northwest, and Laikipia to the south, and Isiolo to the east. The Samburu people entirely depend on livestock for their livelihood. 85% of the cash income, or maybe the livelihood of this community, entirely depend on livestock. We cover an area of about 21,000 square kilometers, and we have about a population of nearly 283,000 people. This is based on the 2016 census. As a community, or as an indigenous community, Samburu people, we are affected by several drivers that maybe affect food and nutrition within the county. One of it being rainfall. Over the years, rain has not been consistent. It has not been enough, and again, it is very difficult for even the communities to predict, or maybe to tell whether rain is coming or drought is coming. And this is purely maybe brought by the climate change. Initially, our elders are able maybe even to look at the stars, or maybe the planets, or maybe movement of the way livestock behave, or maybe wildlife movement, to tell whether rain is coming, and they will be able to plan themselves better. But currently, even if they see the stars, or maybe the position of planets, or maybe stars, or movement of livestock, then they are not even able to correctly state whether there is rain or drought. And this now affect them in terms of planning, in terms of maybe even planning their grazing patterns, and sometimes a prolonged drought also affect the livestock, because livestock die because of that. And even livestock diseases increases as drought maybe continue being worse. The other thing that affects us in terms of food and nutrition security is insecurity and conflict. Given the fact that the rains are failing, also pasture and or other natural resources are also becoming scarce. Pasture getting maybe grassland are shrinking, rangeland being degraded because of overgrazing and livestock staying in one point for long. Water is also becoming scarce. So you'll find that communities converge in one point, maybe where resources are still there. And this causes conflict over this resource. And sometimes people end fighting and killing one another, or even stealing livestock from one another because of accessing the rangeland resources. Livestock diseases also increases because of that convergence of livestock in one particular point, increasing diseases, and even you'll find that within the communities we lack experts that maybe understand or maybe can support the communities when this critical moment fails. The other challenge that we have is that you'll find that the professionals that we have within the communities are not from the local community, so their concentration within the environment which is harsh to them sometimes become very limited, and they tend to look for maybe jobs or maybe opportunities elsewhere. So this is another thing that is affecting food and security within the region. There is also another issue, another critical issue, that's livestock markets. Because of COVID-19, the current situation in COVID-19, most of the livestock markets are closed. So you'll find that the pastoral or maybe the communities are not able to sell their livestock to the markets. And again, due to this, sometimes if there's market, then livestock prices are down, and the communities are not able to meet with and sometimes healthcare is becoming a challenge. We have incidents where malnutrition, especially within young children and maybe lactating mothers, is becoming worse. And we have maybe sometimes also the organizations we work with sometimes support them to address those issues. Yeah, so in terms of food security, the county government, the national government are also trying to do something, though reaching out to, there are some hard areas to reach. So the government is not able to reach to the communities because road infrastructure is very poor, and vehicles are not, maybe transport is not available to the communities in those areas. Yeah, so that's possibly what I want to talk on food security.
Thank you for that presentation, Titus. And I can, from looking at climate variability and how pastoral communities are at risk of increasing challenges in the coming years. One thing that comes to my mind, or one question that comes to my mind is, given your knowledge about what satellite Earth observations can offer, what ways do you see, or do you think are the most efficient ways to try and get information to pastoral communities? Like, what way can all the insights and information that can already be harvested from satellite information be brought to use within pastoral communities?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I think the best thing to do is that we need to build the capacity of the local communities, and again, making the data, the geo data, user-friendly, so that maybe it can be interpreted easily by the local communities. Also, you find that the areas that we are, even satellite coverage is not covering the whole region or maybe the whole area that we cover. So I think if GEO can support us in doing that, then we'll be able to access that data.
One other thought is on, from all the challenges that you spoke about, like, what do you think is, one of the most pressing things that, it urgently needs to be addressed in order to improve food security? Like, which one do you think has the most significant impact on pastoral livelihoods in northern Kenya?
Yeah, I think addressing climate change impacts, negative impacts. For example, making sure that the community has the capacity to adapt to situations. Maybe when there's heavy rains, then they will be able to support themselves. Number two, again, ensuring that maybe satellite images are available across the landscape. And the other one is also ensuring that maybe we have a internet or maybe a signal network that we can be able to access.
Fantastic. So, these challenges, I think, across, if we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, are true, and it becomes, incredibly important to be able to also package the information that comes across. So I would like to, move on to hear from our next speaker, and I think we'll have some time closer to the end to revisit some of this discussion, because I think her talk will also, her talk will also come in to bring another context. So I'm really excited to introduce Ms. Hindo Ibrahim. She's the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change from the Bororo Pastoral Community in Chad. Ms. Ibrahim is founded the Association of Indigenous Women and the Peoples of Chad, and works to empower Indigenous voices and ensure their inclusion on international platforms. So over to you, Hindo. Really excited to hear from you today.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you here in Indigenous Peoples GEO Summit. Discussions around food, it's really very crucial, and especially like my brother said, I'm also coming from a pastoral communities. So I am coming from the Sahel regions where there is the higher food insecurity and hunger around the world. And as I'm coming from indigenous pastoralist communities, so I'm seeing that changing over the years. So let me share with you just some concrete examples, and we can take it from there. Our peoples do not depend from the end of the month salaries. They do not get a cash to go to the supermarket buying them food, or they do not have a fridge where they can put them food for the week and eat them. So in my peoples, we depend from nature. Forest is our supermarket, our pharmacy, our food, our water. And when the rain is come, we get our food. When the rain didn't come well, we do not get our food, and it's called hunger and food insecurity. With the climate change impact, we are seeing our season change a lot. So our rain season become much and much shorter with irregular rains, and that can make a drought. That's the issue of the last year, with a heat more than 48 and 50 degrees Celsius. So imagine if you have the crops, you cannot grow them up in this kind of weather. Or like this year's, the rain season become much heavier with a lot of floods. So even in our towns, there are all flood, and people move with the canoe inside the city. And when you go to the community level, we have one of the river who didn't give any water for 30 years. So since I was a baby, but this year, this river was full of water, and the president was happy to go there and visit. So when you see these extreme weather events, for us, we are living the climate impact, and that is directly impacting our food security. And that's how we are seeing like this year also become very special in the Sahel region, and especially my country, Chad, who become the #1 food insecurity impacted. So from this season change, for us, it's creating a shrinking the resources, and peoples are fighting to get access to those shrinking resources. And then it's create a conflict because everyone wanted to eat. So last week, there was a communities fight where there was more than 100 people dead. Why? Because there was farming place and there was water point. They are pastoral peoples. And this is exactly what is happening around all the Sahel regions. Now, the indigenous communities who used to live in harmony with the others, they turn it into enemy because of those resources, because of access of the food. And from our own cattle, you know, just like 10 years ago when I used to milk with my grandmother, we used to milk 2 times a day during the rain season, 1 time a day during a dry season. But now, during the dry season, we milk only 1 time every 2 days. The first day, we milk for ourselves. The second days, we leave the milk for the baby cows. Because otherwise we cannot fit our needs together between our animals and between ourselves. So that have a huge impact in our survival and in our diet. And that's why there is an increase of the malnutrition in the communities. And then people need to get a new food system to get adapt, because we used to just exchange our milk with the cereals and it's make a perfect diet for us. We do not have any sickness. But now in indigenous communities, there are new sickness that like diabetes, like cancer. So they're experiencing a lot of new disease that coming because of the diet that changed a lot. They have to complete from buying to another market that we do not know the product. And suddenly on this one, we are seeing the industrialized agriculture who are coming more and more, grabbing our land and making a production who are not respecting the nature. And this is the case in a developed countries. When we take the example of our cattle who are very ecosystemic based and carbon neutral because they protect the nature, and then the industrialized cattle in the developed world who are the first emitters of the carbon in the atmospheres. When you take the example of France, agriculture have like 20% of the emissions, but they do not have technique or technology to just to calm them down, because they continuously say they wanted to feed the peoples, they wanted to meat, they wanted to milk. At the end of the day, the overproduction of the milk, they turn it into the powder, they send them to our communities that are impacted by the climate change, but who are living in a good life. So it is changing completely the way of production and on consumptions in an indigenous communities way. However, we do live with that with a lot of solutions. Because of our way of living with the nature, we know how to move from one place to another one to leave the space to get regenerated in a natural way. And we also try to manage milking 1 time a day, and we leave the next day to the baby cow. So we try to build our resilience by sharing the resources and by better managing those resources in order to feed our families and to sustain the food system. But the international communities need to understand they have to tackle the climate change as a urgent needs solutions for food securities. And they need also to understand that indigenous peoples have a lot of traditional knowledge on how they can sustain the productions and how they have the balance in the consumptions, and learn from us to do not waste the food, but to take our technique to implement in them industrialized agriculture who are not sustainable for our planet and for the peoples. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hindo. You raised quite a number of really interesting things. For example, the transition and the competition with agricultural land use, that is compromising the pastoral ecosystem. And we do have a question from Slido. I do have a question for myself too, but I'd like to ask, there's a question from Katie, who is asking, what are the major obstacles in terms of access and ease of use with climate change and weather forecasting data? So what is So I guess I could start with my question is, what are some ways that forecasting information is being brought to pastoralists, and what are some things that are making it hard for them to access this information in West Africa?
So access to information is very hard for, I can say, all the Sahel regions. Why? Because most of the informations are given through the channel that are not adapted to the majority of the peoples. We have more than 70% of the peoples who are living in the rural areas, depending from agriculture, pastoralists, or fisher. And from those peoples, most of them do not have access to the electricity. They are not in school. They are not hospitals. And most of the information channel are passing through TV, radios, or social media. And when those information pass, they are passing also in the major languages are French, because they are French colony, or one of the local major language. But the indigenous communities do not speak firstly all those languages. And if we take the example of my communities, even Chad have Arabic and French as national languages, they do not speak those languages. Even if they have the radio, but they do not have the radios, they do not have the TVs. So the weather forecast, who can be the most important information to share with farmers, are not reaching to those farmers. They are just giving to the townspeople to see if they can have to wear the umbrella or the sunglass because the weather change. So what is the importance of this if I just have to relook myself that because of the weather to go to the work or to go to the market or organize my birthday party? So I think it will be most important if those information are translated to the communities who are producing the food in the tables to all of us. If they can know how, when the rain is going to come and how they can better plan them agriculture, that will be the useful of the data. So I try to do this information with my organizations through how we can use the traditional knowledge of my communities and the science knowledge together. So I do that in two ways. Firstly, in the 3D participatory mapping, and now I'm going to do next year 2D participatory mapping on how I can collect the communities and the science knowledge to build a map in order to give the information on the knowledge we have and better manage the resources among the communities, because they know how they can plan them traditional weather forecast. So how they can exchange this one and reduce the conflict over the resources and they build a food security. And second is through the collection of the traditional knowledge of the communities and link it with the science knowledge or with the meteorological peoples that we are working together. How we can exchange the information and create a database who are not based on the alphabetic that if you didn't went to school you cannot read or you cannot understand. Can be based on the icon, how all the communities and the scientist peoples have the common language, and then they can decide, exchange, and get the information from the science and then send the information from traditional knowledge in order to prepare a better weather forecast for not only our communities, but for all the rest of the communities, because it's very rich information. When you take the science knowledge only in your application, you check, they can tell you, oh, it's going to be sunny, surprise, it's raining, or it's going to rain, oh, surprise, it's sunny. But if you link the traditional knowledge and with the science together, it can give you at least 90% of the right information for all of us.
Thank you so much for that response. You made me reflect on a lot of things, like, sometimes you think that radio is sufficient for reaching rural communities, but in this case, it wouldn't be. My question to you was then, it's more of a thinking process, actually. So some of the things that you can do with satellite data is map like watering holes and water levels and there's watering holes. So how do we get from a map product? So, like with your work with participatory mapping, I can see how it could benefit from, large scale satellite based mapping that could be validated by the village. But then how do we get from very early warning fact-based information and try and get it to the community as quickly as possible? Because I'm sensing that perhaps you might have to have a lot of, interfacing with the community. So how do we accelerate making that information rapidly useful for where you could, pastoralists could go to water their animals? How do we accelerate getting that information there?
So I think we can do it in two ways, how we can accelerate the early warning system. Firstly, we cannot design the information and go give it to the communities as beneficiaries. That cannot work. So firstly, we need to design those information together with the communities. In the early warning system, it needs to be focused on, it is in the water, it is in the food, it is in whatever. So what is the priorities of the communities and how it can be designed together to give them this information that they wanted to have, not the information that we wanted to give them. And secondly, we can do it by using the technology, because many people are talking about creating apps that can give the early warning system information. So if the communities design their needs together with the people who wanted to help them, so at the second time, we can have the step of, it is going to be an applications. It is the communities can get any smartphone. Can they get access to the electricity or solar panel to charge it? Or they can just get it for 1 month and being excited. I have a smartphone, then I can make my photos, my videos, and the next of the day you don't have electricity and you just put it in your pocket and wait the next week to go and charge it. So they are a process. So this technology need to set up firstly the first step of giving them the power energy that they can have access on need. And secondly, maybe if it is the radio that can work, or if it is the phone with application that can work, or we can use the old system from mouth to the air that we can give the information, because it's still this one is the one who is working. From my organization, we get through the phone during this COVID. This is the best example of how we can create or learn from this one to create an early warning system. So when the COVID come, all the information are going also through radio, TVs, and in the major languages. And then while the COVID is going very fast information, every day at the beginning they say okay, the market are closed. Next day they say oh, the pharmacy are closed. Next day they say oh, no one can go out. Okay, 6 people cannot gather. So every single day there are new decisions that coming. But to the communities, those decisions cannot reach out to them. So they become victim because they cannot apply those measures to their own health, but they become also victim because the other soldiers who understand the information, they can make them pay a tax 2-3 times. So what we did is just getting through the phone, and every single decisions we call the community chief is there. We say, you know what is happening? There are those things happening. And then this sickness, it is this one. So just to be cautious, don't accept anyone come enter the communities. Don't accept that someone tell you that. Don't go in this place if you have this symptom. So we have daily catch up with the communities from mouth to airing and giving the information in the mother tongue. And then they just when we give them the information, they say, Hindo called me and then she said this one, and then he passed the information to this one, and this one passed it to the others. And then at the end of the day, just in within an hour, the community have all the information. So maybe we can use this system, but by the time we can create the process of giving them access to the energy, access to the maybe phone or radios, and disseminate the information of the early warning system. But listening from them is the most important part.
Absolutely agree with you. Thank you so much, Hindo. So I'm going to move on so we can hear from Ioana Dimitrova, Fernandez de la Rion now. I apologize if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. He's Chief Indigenous Peoples Unit. He works in the Chief Indigenous Peoples Unit, Partnerships and UN Collaborations. Over to you, Jan.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is the audio good? Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you so much, and thank you to GEO Alliance for inviting us. And let me greet the rest of panelists. I was listening very carefully to Hindo. Every time I coincide with Hindo, it's a great learning opportunity, and today has been no exception. Now, let me, Catherine, brief a little bit or share a little bit what we are doing with respect to indigenous peoples mapping, but also in relation, if you allow me, to indigenous food systems, territorial management, and the UN Food Systems Summit that we are going to be having next year in 2021. Now, if we take indigenous peoples around the world and we use the last figures that ILO just released end of last year, we are talking of more than 470 million indigenous peoples across the world, living in 7 sociocultural regions, living in more than 90 countries. If we put them together in a single country, this will be the 3rd most populous country in the world. But in reality, when we look at cartography and information systems about the indigenous peoples, we all talked about 90+ countries, but you will not find a map about these 90+ countries. Now, why is this? But one of the reasons is that the definition of indigenous peoples, or the characterization of indigenous peoples, as per the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007, is very much based on self-determination and self-identification. So the risk of putting together a map, and this is something that we have been working with the GEO, we have been working with some of the UN organizations, and we've been doing in FAO with the cartography unit in FAO. And one of the challenges that we have when we put together a map of indigenous peoples is not the countries where you find references in the legislation, the constitution of some of the policies to indigenous peoples, but all of those other countries where you do not necessarily find reference to indigenous peoples, and by placing them in a map without a close reference to legislation, you could be somehow hinting that there is not indigenous peoples in that country. And this is a major issue that we have, and we are not 100% sure on how to resolve. We are talking to different experts, we are talking to different indigenous peoples on how to go about this. Because the last thing that we would like is that by trying to put together the first map of 90+ countries where indigenous peoples live across the world, we are saying at the same time that there are certain countries when there is not indigenous peoples, and this might be exactly the opposite of what we are trying to say. Why is this issue important? This issue is important for a number of consequences. The first one is that one of the things that we are seeing is that without an identity, without an ID card, without being registered in the census, it's very difficult to access basic services from the different states and countries where indigenous peoples live. It's difficult to access education. It's difficult to access health. It's difficult to access basic economic development packages, services, social protection. So the moment that you are, between brackets, invisible, because you are not accounted for, it's very difficult to access from the development benefits that are benefiting many other citizens, women and men in any other country. So the issue of identity is very important. It's also crucial for food security. As we know, many of the characteristics of indigenous peoples and their food systems is that their rights to territory, their collective rights to communal resources are very much often based on customary rights. In many instances, these are not necessarily recognized in the form of a title. This does not mean that those rights are not accurate, they have not been exercised for years, and they have a lot of validity in legal terms. Indeed, they do, because there is recognition of customary rights. But it is true that in the current situation where there is a lot of pressure from extractive industries, Hindo was talking about the pressure from commercial agriculture and commercial intensive livestock. This is creating displacement of indigenous peoples. And we have seen this also now during the COVID-19, how indigenous peoples whose tenure rights were more informal in many instances were displaced from their ancestral lands. So the combination of a lack of maps, the combination of lack of tools, also now with this push that we are seeing it towards the digitalization of agriculture, where everything is now being geo-referenced through the use of metadata, through the use of mobile phones, mobile devices, GIS, GPS, what we see is that there is this issue with indigenous peoples that we need to resolve together. At the same time, the last thing we do is if we put together a map of indigenous peoples' territories, we put together a map of biodiversity and indigenous peoples' lands, that this actually contributes to indigenous peoples being displaced from their lands. That will be a disservice to humanity. Exactly what we are trying to do is the opposite. And there is another factor I would like to throw into the equation, and is the rights and the intellectual property rights over the knowledge that indigenous peoples exercise in their territories. Unless we resolve this, there is a risk in putting together maps identifying indigenous peoples' territories where, if you wish, all the legal architecture that protects indigenous peoples' rights over the usage and knowledge that they have exercised in those lands could be put. Indigenous peoples could be pushed away from these lands, and they could be even be displaced. So all of this, I'm speaking because we do see this in many countries in the world, and to the surprise of many of us during the COVID-19, instead of the pressure going down, we saw the pressure going up in many territories, let alone indigenous peoples in the Amazon that got infected through illegal miners, colonists and agricultural people that settle in their lands. We have seen how indigenous peoples have been further displaced and pushed from their lands during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a major issue. We see, unfortunately, that the killing of indigenous peoples and environmental protectionists is not going down. Over the past years, we see that the 4 or 5 countries have this tragic statistic of having the most number of indigenous people's killings continues. And this is an issue that we need to address because if we also put into the equation pastoralists, and Hindo was talking about many of the pastoralist communities in Central Africa, in Chad, the number of pastoralists and indigenous peoples that are in this situation is extremely large. It's several million people. And some of them are among the food insecurity people across the world. Now, over the past 5 years, we have seen how the statistics and the numbers of food insecurity, unfortunately, have gone up in the world. We see that we have this perverse situation where we have 2 billion people in situation of overweight and obesity in developed and developing countries. But at the same time, the number of people in food insecurity and hunger has increased. So unless we come up with a different approaches, particularly with respect to food systems, unless we come up with more sustainable food systems, and unless we put our collective efforts together now to influence this UN Food Systems Summit that will take place in 2021 to incorporate indigenous peoples and pastoralists on their own rights, with their own traditional knowledge, with their own cosmogony, with the recognition of their territorial management practices and their lands, it is unlikely that we will meet the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals for the year 2030. In particular, the SDG number 2, which is the one that our organization, FAO, is a custodian of. So all of these are issues that we need to look at them together. And the connection between the territory, the mapping, and the recognition of indigenous peoples is something that collectively we need to look at, because it's fundamental if we want to ensure that these 476 plus million people across the world, living in 7 sociocultural regions, living in 90 countries, see their rights respected. And this is fundamental for humanity if we are to come up with more sustainable ways of feeding ourselves. Thank you so much, Catherine. I'll be very glad to answer any question that might come up. Thank you so much for the use of the word.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that, for the great overview. First, I'd like to remind our participants, if you have questions to any of our panelists, to please post that question at slido.com, slido.com, and the keyword for this particular summit is GEO Indigenous Summit, and it's one word. So please do share questions that you might have for our panelists. And for Jan, I have a question for you. You did mention at the beginning that part of the effort of what you're trying to do is map these communities across the globe. It's I can imagine that it's incredibly challenging, but I was wondering how you're integrating satellite data in mapping in mapping these communities, as well as what opportunities you see from your experience, from what you've learned, doing this work, that we could use this satellite data to better understand, the overall functioning of the ecosystems that these communities have, protected for thousands of years, that, could be shared with the world in a way that, would be respected and understood, because, the going back to Hindo's point and what you mentioned as well, this commercial agriculture, compromising the ecosystem is making it harder and harder because, it's seen to be more valuable. So how can we use satellite data to showcase the value of really protecting these communities?
But Catherine, thank you so much for the question, which is not an easy one. So I will try to answer it to the best of my capacity. Let me clarify first that the bulk of our work has not been mapping indigenous peoples and their communities within the countries. We actually have been trying to identify what are these 90 plus countries that we all say that indigenous peoples live on. And how have we done this? We have gone through the Constitution, the national legislation. So we have done an analysis of existing national legislation in different languages, the Constitution, different pieces of policy, to make sure that there is a recognition of the existence of indigenous peoples in these countries. As you know, many of the countries all over the world do not recognize indigenous peoples. So we felt that as UN, we needed to go back and do an analysis of all of this legislation that has been endorsed and approved by many years, sometimes by a different government from the one that is right now in the office, but still there is already a precedent of the recognition of indigenous people's existence in that country. I think the point you allude to, which is the role of satellite imagery to map out indigenous peoples, their territories and traditional knowledge, is a pending question for all of us, because in many ways it's a double-edged sword. Whenever we have put together maps of areas of natural value and hiding biodiversity, and we have overlapped this with indigenous peoples' territories, we have seen a very important coincidence and overlapping. We have seen this in Central America with the map that IUCN did, that was the continuation of the National Geographic map, and we have seen this in other parts of the world. Later on, what we have seen is, thanks to work being done by some academics in the UK and UNESCO, is that if we add another layer, which is the layer of cultural heritage and languages, we see that there is a very interesting overlap between cultural diversity and number of languages, biodiversity, and indigenous peoples' territories. Let's not forget, particularly now that we are in the UN decade of indigenous languages, that 4,000 out of the 6,000 existing languages in the world are indigenous languages. So when we overlapped all of this, we see a very interesting connection between biodiversity, cultural diversity, and indigenous peoples' territories. At the same time, if we start doing maps in different countries to map where indigenous peoples live, I'm very much concerned that this might be a double-edged sword that might be taken up by corporations, by mining companies, by extractive industries that will make use of these satellite images to displace indigenous peoples at a lower cost in terms of finances. Of course, I'm being ironic, but what I'm trying to say here is I think we have some homework to do before that, which is to ensure the recognition of indigenous peoples in these countries, ensure that their rights are respected, to once they are placed, their lands into a map, we don't contribute to their displacement. And this is a major concern that we all have. And I must admit that we don't have all the answers. We are working with the experts in FAO. Some of them are working with you. And actually, we are all the time interfacing with indigenous peoples to understand what to do. I remember we had a similar discussion several years ago, and indigenous peoples told us that they didn't want their territories to be in a map because they were very concerned that this was going to bring more evil than good. So I'm afraid I don't have all the answers for your question, and this is work in progress, at least for us in FAO. I will also like to learn from some of the other organizations. Perhaps you are more advanced than us, and certainly we would like to learn from you.
I mean, the point you make is a very valid point about it being a double-edged sword, because, you know, there are more powerful individuals who, you know, would try and take advantage of the communities, as well as you also mentioned this before, the fact that, you know, they don't have identification. So a lot of services that the general community or population would benefit from, they wouldn't, you know, makes it, in the sense about land ownership, it's very difficult in that sense for them to fight for their land through legal systems. So the legal systems have to recognize their land. In that sense, it's very complicated. But we do have two questions still for you from Slido, and one of them also relates to how mapping could help. But then the first part I think is interesting because you've addressed the mapping part. This is from David, and he is asking what kind of actions is FAO taking to address, you know, some of the impacts of climate change in regions like Central America. And the second, I'll just go through them so that you can address them at the same time. The second one is what activities. The question is, how do we focus activities for the UN Food Summit that you mentioned? You know, there'll be hundreds of thousands of people, but what are the 1 to 2 things to do, you know, to bring, me trying to complete this question, how I perceive it, to bring the issues of indigenous people to, you know, to the top of what's being discussed and protecting their livelihoods, as well as you did mention a little bit at the beginning, something about indigenous food, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about, you know, what kinds of activities or programs are directed towards making sure that these survive, you know, the revolution in agriculture and all of that stuff. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. I will try to reply to the best of my capacity. I wanted to make a reflection, if you allow me, before answering both questions, and on the maps, related to the question you asked me earlier and the satellite image. It's very interesting. If we take a Convention 169, ILO 169, Convention 169, the majority of the countries that have endorsed this convention, which is fundamental for indigenous people's rights, is in Latin America. At the same time, is the region of the world where indigenous people's rights have been most recognized in Iberoamerica and Latin America. But at the same time, when we looked at the countries where most of the killing of indigenous peoples takes place, out of the first 5 countries, 4 are in Latin America. So here we also see a contradiction between the recognition of the rights. That's where most of the cartography is assisting about indigenous people's territories. They have the rights to the lands in many cases. At the same time, they are getting killed. And I think it's very much connected to some of the things that Hindo was mentioning about commercial intensive agriculture, the pressure from intensive livestock, the pressure from intensive mining. And it's a part of the world where very often the population density is not as high as in Asia and other parts of the world. But yet, for whatever reason, we are seeing these numbers increase and not decrease. Let me try to answer the 2 questions. The first one on Central America and what could be done in relation to indigenous peoples and climate change and how mapping could help. I think there's an area of work where satellite image and mapping is essential, and it's anything that has to do with disaster prevention and getting ready for climatic emergencies. We are seeing now with the storms that are affecting Central America, but at the same time, when we looked at in the satellite images, and we cross this with cartography and the different tools that we have and an aerial photograph, we do see what are the areas that are extremely vulnerable for climate change. And very often we see that these areas are inhabited by indigenous peoples or also by Afro-descendants in Central America and Latin America. So there's a major area for work in terms of applying the tools that we have to prevent disasters. You cannot prevent a storm from hitting Central America, but you can easily warn the people, and you can have contention measures in place to make sure that the effects of these storms are not as drastic and devastating as they are being today. And the likelihood of storms and climate change related events increasing is there. All the scientists are telling us that most likely we are going to see the climatic emergencies increase and not decrease. So certainly there's a major role not only in Central America but all over the world. But in Central America, because it's a hurricane-prone area, certainly we should be looking at. What are we doing in relation to indigenous food systems and the UN food systems? But the UN Food Systems Summit is going ahead. It's going to be at the level of heads of state, prime ministers, very high-level summit. All the different organizations are working towards this summit. It is not clear how indigenous peoples are going to participate. Let us don't forget that some indigenous peoples, they are nations, they have kings, they have queens, they have traditional governance structures. They do not have a state, but they do have a history of representativeness and a history of institutionality that for the time being is not well reflected in the architecture of the UN Food Systems Summit. There's ongoing discussions to see whether they are going to be allowed to participate through the UN Permanent Forum or through the UN Special Rapporteur. The UN has 4 mechanisms that support indigenous peoples, and it's yet to be seen whether they are going to be allowed to participate in the discussions. What are we doing from the FAO side? In October this year, end of September, this year, the countries endorsed the launching of a global hub on indigenous peoples' food systems. We are chairing it in my unit. 17 institutions have joined us. The last one that joined us was the Department of Geography from Cambridge University, but we have different universities like the University of Greenwich, University of Monash, Massey University, McGill, a number of indigenous organizations. UNCCC has joined, so has UNESCO and the UN Permanent Forum. And the idea here is to work collectively in characterizing what are the differences between indigenous peoples' food systems and how we understand commercial food systems that are being analyzed to be made more sustainable. Many of us, we believe from the work we've been doing with indigenous peoples, and I think Hindo was explaining it very well, that many of the indigenous food systems across the world have been sustainable for hundreds of years. As a matter of fact, they have come to our days alive and feeding the populations. So why don't we learn from these indigenous people's food systems instead of trying to come up with new theories about making some of the commercial food systems that we have more sustainable? I think there's many elements about tuning with the natural cycles, resilience, respecting the environment, protecting biodiversity that we can certainly learn from indigenous people's food systems instead of trying to come up with a magic formula that might be an intellectual or a mental creation, when in reality we have a lot to observe and a lot to learn from indigenous peoples. So this is what we are trying to do from FAO. We are trying to ensure that the scientists learn from indigenous peoples, they listen to them, and at the same time supporting indigenous peoples to provide a platform that can communicate with these scientists and with the UN Food Systems Summit to have their voices heard. It's all work in progress. It moves very slow, so we need all your support, and we would like to count with all your support.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jan, for that, for the very good explanation. And I agree with you on the last point about recognizing what they have to show us to learn about how to make our own food systems sustainable. I would like to circle back to Titus's, first response to one of the first questions that we asked in the beginning, to share, what ways do you envision capacity building for the use of satellite data for some of the work that you were trying to do with the community in Kenya? Like what specific things do you think that GEO can help work with you on ensuring that the data that is available is useful for work supporting the communities? I don't know if you're still there, Titus.
Yeah, I'm still there. So
absolutely.
So the data maybe that we might require is possibly maybe looking at degraded areas. How do we identify the areas that are degraded? Again, status of forest. Using the satellite images, how can we access that data? Again, is there any opportunities for development of applications that can be used within on maybe phones that are cheaply available?
This is an next thinking about what Hindo said before, is that trying to make sure that it is co-developed with, a person like yourself and a person like Hindo, to make sure that, and the community, of course, to make sure that it is relevant and that it's packaged in a way that is appropriate for that particular community. So, for example, integrating those data into, into a way that's accessible, be it print maps, or be it some of the efforts that Hindo is doing. I don't know if Hindo, there is something you want to add about what specific kind of capacity building that might be useful for the work that you're doing. Hindo, are you there?
Trying to just unmute myself. Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. I think my brother Jan here said also how the collaboration between indigenous peoples and UN agency can help to better protect the right of indigenous peoples. I think when we talk about capacity building, it's have also to go in two ways. So the collaboration with the UN organizations, with other organizations like conservation organizations that can help indigenous peoples to protect them rights. And rights also, they are human rights, but they are also intellectual property rights around our traditional knowledge to better protect the food system, and then the way that we are creating the food sovereignty. And another way of capacity building, it's how the other system from industrialized agriculture countries, from the governments, the person who call themselves expert, can come and learn from our own system, from what we do, how we do to protect, which kind of seed we are planting during each season, how it's work, and how we can combine the two knowledge. So this capacity building way also can work. They can learn more from us. And then the other way, it's how we can collaborate and build each other capacity. Of course, we wanted to have access to the technology. We wanted to have access to satellite data information, early warning system, as we talked about it earlier. So how all this can be set up in the process, but we don't want it to be just a recipient or a beneficiary from the new thing that we do not know, but we wanted to build it together and help the others also to learn. And the framework that we have the SDGs. So through the SDGs, objective 2, how we can fight all hunger, how we can all build up the food security, it's already defined. So we must use the SDGs platform, where they have 6 reference of indigenous peoples. And another things Jan talked about it, we have the food summit. So the food summit also is going to organize by the UN, but it have to be all the stakeholders engaged there. So how the role of indigenous peoples will be there, how it can be also the changing of the knowledge, but capacity building of the knowledge. And finally, we can use also the framework of the Paris agreements, who recognize the indigenous peoples' knowledge and capacity for adaptations and mitigation to the climate change. And one of the pillars among the three others of the platform, it's the capacity building. But the first pillar is also very important, is knowledge exchange. And then the third pillar, it's policy building. So when we do the capacity building and the both sides, so it can help to exchange the knowledge, it can help also to build a better policies.
Thank you so much, Hindo. Thank you so much, Hindo, for that great response. As a person who's been doing a lot of capacity building, I absolutely agree with you that co-development and understanding the local context or the organizational context helps make things more consumable and acceptable. And this is one way, one of the most efficient ways to realize technology uptake. I'm going to move real quick so we can start hearing from our presenters in the lightning talks session, part of our session. And first, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Douglas Da Silva, who's from the University of Zurich. The title of his talk is Desertification Gradient Influences on Livelihood Vulnerability in Wayuu, the indigenous community of La Guaira in Colombia.
Hello, and thank you for coming to my talk in regards to how desertification gradients influence the livelihood vulnerability of the Wayuu indigenous communities of Colombia. And I begin with, we're talking about the Wayuu people. So they're a Native American ethnic group living in the northernmost region of Colombia. And in this northernmost region of Colombia, it's called the La Guajira department, and it's about 20,000 square kilometers. And as you can see, it's right above the Amazon, but you can see that how the shaded areas without the green on top tells us something about this region, which is right now going through what is called the process of desertification, which is defined as the reduction of the productivity of the land, where it may no longer support the same plant growth it had in the past. And as depicted here, shows that it has this very characteristic cracked type of soils for that. So the desertification is likely due to climatic influences and also land management. And then for the study, we're actually looking at how desertification affects public health. So there was an article back in 2015 that said the desertification, poor access to water and food may have influenced the deaths of about 5,000 Wayuu children in the past 8 years. And so our study is trying to disentangle these different variables and try to quantify their influences. So desertification is it's not a homogeneous type of phenomena. So there's different gradients to it. So as you can see, together with the environmental services of Colombia, we're able to actually define the different gradients of that from no desertification going through low, medium, and high to try to see what are the differences between these regions and the livelihood of the Wayuu. So the research question is, how do these different gradients of desertification affect the Wayuu? And we looked at different social demographics, livelihood strategies, access to food, water, and healthcare, natural resources, and looking at their social networks. So how we did this, we looked at basically the low, medium, and high desertifications, and then looked at the livelihood vulnerability with different variables as depicted here: social demographics, strategies for livelihood, health, food, water, natural resources, and social networks. And as the results for the social, this livelihood vulnerability, we took the low, medium, and high desertification, and you see that all the results, they basically look similar, and yet between the desertification gradients, it gets closer. The closer to zero, the closer to the center, the most vulnerable, the farther away from the center is the least vulnerable. So you can see that they are definitely vulnerable in many spots like water, food, and health. But as you start going through the desertification, the situation seems to be getting worse. So basically the take-home message here is that the Wayuu, they do have a strong social structures, as it shows in the graphs, but they lack of, they observe a lack of natural resources, water, and basic goods and services to thrive. And such disparities are exacerbated in the high desertification. And these high desertification areas are the ones that you have the highest rates of malnutrition and mortality among the Wayuu. And these areas areas should be the ones prioritized for interventions and basic development. With that, I leave you with my contacts and the websites for the current study and the initiatives that we have through an organization called Mama Tierra. And with that, I thank you so much, and we'll probably take a question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Douglas, for that interesting lightning talk. I do have a question for you. I was curious. I was curious as to from your research whether there are certain things that you could have documented that the community itself is trying to do to address or reverse desertification, and if there's a recognition of its impact, and in some cases how it can be irreversible from the community.
Yeah, not in a sense that is irreversible from the community. They are right now, because basically they are 100% dependent on the environment, and therefore put my video on for a second. So they're 100% dependent on the environment, and because of the process of desertification, they actually look for sources of water. They actually look for ways to be able to cultivate the land, but everything that they have is too shallow. So meaning you'd have to dig deep into the earth, for example, to get different sources of water, or for you to get better, because water is the main problem for everything, for cultivating. And they're able to actually dig their own wells, but the water that they're able to get is too salty. And it doesn't actually, they're not able to drink it. They're not able to actually use it for the land, for production. So they are at a point that they need, in order for them to thrive, and because the mortality is so high over there, they're at a point that you actually need to bring outside government sources. So basically, I'm trying to work together with the government and with different institutions to actually bring more infrastructure to them, because their natural resources, their rivers have dried, everything. So they actually do try to do things. They're very resilient. Like, if you want to talk about resilience, they're the most resilient people. I got to spend, quite a long time with them. And this is the thing. They definitely need that infrastructure to be able to give them, water, at least water, for them to be able to thrive. And so this is the biggest thing that I was able to see through the research, through looking at their different livelihood strategies.
So this one for you to think on, and if we have time at the end, we can revisit. There's a question, which is if you know about GEO's LDN, the work on land degradation neutrality, and to see if there are possible links to some of the work that you are doing.
Yes, I'm actually partnered with the UNCCD of Latin America, so we're working in partnership. I have through Oxfam and other different places, we're trying to get a little bit more. Right now, they're a little bit more worried about keeping COVID from going up there. So it's a little bit, and this is something that this research that I did, it just started it's within the past year that we've been doing it. So right now there's more a bit of a COVID push, but I do have contacts through the UNCCD and Oxfam.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Douglas.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time. Right. So I would like to move on to our next lightning talk and introduce Yona Dimitrova, who's an anthropologist and archaeologist based in the UK and is one of the first prize winners of the GEO Indigenous Hackathon, Hack for COVID. So let's just listen to her lightning talk, and maybe we'll get a few questions at the end.
Map team, and welcome to our lightning talk. Indigenous-led mapping has become an indispensable tool in the struggle of Indigenous peoples to claim their rights to land and resources. It has also, however, come under certain criticism for its potential to increase state regulation, replace Indigenous conceptions of territory and property, and also to create conflict. Our inspiration is to be able to co-develop a functional solution to the Namunyak app challenge submitted by Titus for the 2020 GEO Hackathon. Hence, we are trying to create a new way to label places on a map using local cultural symbols instead of traditional geographical coordinates. The Samburu community are pastoralists and semi-nomads living in the Samburu County in north-central Kenya, which is just in here. The subsistence economy is fundamentally based on the herding of livestock such as cattle, goats, camels, and sheep. Therefore, livestock plays a great deal as means of livelihood. At the moment, the Samburu market is of huge importance to the community as they trade and exchange goods exactly like livestock. Sometimes travel to the market could take up to 2 whole days. However, due to the current COVID-19 lockdown and also to changing weather patterns, the traditional movement and exchange of livestock has been altered. And what is more, because of lockdown, Samburu do not have easy or even any access to the market. Therefore, they cannot sell or exchange goods. Currently, mapping and communication technologies are inadequate for the trading needs Samburu have. Mapping with abstract space as the guide do create a fixed and static lines. They create two-dimensional spaces with lines, coordinates, and names which are completely meaningless to Samburu as the language is not written. At the beginning, Samburu were interested in an application that will allow them to map their land using a unique combination of 3 words in their local language. However, our project has changed slightly. The symbols map will encode the real geographical coordinates into 4 symbols, and all symbols have been chosen by the Samburu themselves and hand-drawn by Samburu kids. The map will empower Samburu and give them a sense of control over their county, and it has 3 main components for the benefits of the community: visualization, education, and communication. These are the symbols that we asked Titus to provide us, and they have been hand-drawn by Samburu kids, and they're lovely, they're amazing. And these are some of the designs we have done by digitizing them. A friend of ours helped us with that. Finally, this is a mock-up design of the app, and you can see how it might look. So, for example, we see the person and the 4 symbols down in the squares. So this is where the person is located. If we would like to search someone else, or if we would like to go somewhere else, we just need to type the 4 symbols using just touchpad, and in a minute you would see it would show us where that person would be, and we can easily orient in that land. So where to now? We're continuing to develop the app and have some test trials whenever it's possible, whenever everything's done, and we'll continue to research, and definitely we'll aim at making the app even more dynamic and use dwelling space as a concept which is produced by people and their activities rather than more conventional stance of static space with that frames cartographic representations of indigenous territories so far. Thank you very much for that.
I'm still here. Sorry. Can you hear me? Joanna, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yes.
You can
So my question to you was, what is something that you learned that you didn't expect to learn while you're doing this? It just kind of I was speaking to myself because I was on mute. I was trying to tie in with what Hindo said before about making sure that you're communicating using the right tools. So not alphabet, that people might not be able to read, but symbols in this case, which is really innovative. So I was curious as to what thing did you learn that you did not expect to learn when you started out with this hackathon?
Well, firstly, how to run a project and how to try to develop something that we haven't done before, and also how to be in touch with people all the time and constantly communicate between everyone, and how to collect data and to really find people that are willing to do a project for free. For example, our software engineer, he's doing everything in his free time. So it is quite, I think, quite a rare thing to do. But also very interesting to learn more about the Samburu community, and to meet Titus and to have talks with him, to learn more about him. And also what kind of effects that kind of a project could have on the community, and how can we avoid problems, and what is the best way to develop, in what way would be the best way to develop this app, really. I think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'd like to move on so we can. Yes, hello?
Yeah, it's Titus. Iona, thank you very much for all your efforts, and I appreciate, and even my community appreciate the efforts you are putting in developing that application. I just want to tell you that we are waiting to see the final product, and I'm sure it will go a long way in supporting the Samburu community in accessing better markets and having livestock prices without necessarily moving for several kilometers looking for markets that they are not certain whether they will get the prices they want. So basically, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have a power blackout in northern Kenya, especially in the area that I am. Yeah. So thank you very much, and looking forward for the final product.
And we're looking forward as well, Titus, and thank you as well for answering all our questions and for really suggesting how to do this project and working with us.
Thank you. This is a really good example of co-development and working with the community to ensure that you're answering the questions that they have. So I'm going to move on because we're pressed for time. So we can hear from Andy Dean, who is developed, I guess, is leading the forest management project and is a Hatfield consultant. The title of his talk is Scaling Up EO for Community-Based Forest Management and the European Space Agency's EO for SD, for Sustainable Development Forest Management Initiative. Andy?
My name is Andy Dean, and I'm an Earth observation scientist with Hatfield Consultants based in Vancouver, Canada. We are part of a consortium implementing the Earth Observation for Sustainable Development, EO for SD, Forest Management Project. This is financed by the European Space Agency, or ESA. I want to introduce the project and planned activities in support of community-based forest management. The project goal is to collaborate with international finance institutions such as the World Bank or Asian Development Bank, along with their government and non-government partners in developing countries, to mainstream Earth observation applications for forest management. Skills development and capacity building in Earth observation are important features of the project. We commenced our work in September 2020, and the project will last for 3 years. The project may address several forest-related themes, including REDD+, National Forest Monitoring Systems, drivers of deforestation and degradation, protected areas, mangroves, forest landscape restoration, sustainable forest management, and community-based forest management. An example of the type of project we will support is the Forest Investment Programme, FIP1 project financed by the Asian Development Bank. This is the community-focused investments to address deforestation and degradation in West Kalimantan, Indonesia. The FIP1 project includes activities such as social forestry, agroforestry, community-assisted natural regeneration, and community-based forest fire management. We are designing Earth observation services and methods to support this FIP1 project, including interaction with the communities. We are keen to hear from the community of practice regarding experiences in using Earth observation for community-based forest management, including information requirements of communities, NGOs, and local government, examples of two-way information exchange between communities and Earth observation experts, tools and formats for information collection and delivery, and your experiences, challenges, successes, and examples of good practice. Thank you for your attention. Please feel free to contact me to learn more about the Earth Observation for Sustainable Development Forest Management Project.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that presentation. And I do have a question for you. Someone wanted to know, they posted it anonymously, but they wanted to know whether how this work that you're doing with ESA and the World Bank links with GEO's Global Forest Observation Initiative, which is hosted by FAO, which is also tackling REDD+.
It's a good question, and of course there are a lot of activities related to sustainable forest management around the world, and one of the important objectives of the project is not to duplicate effort, but to look for complementarity and to connect with existing communities of practice such as forest networks, and the GFOI is one of those networks that we want to connect with. And in fact, some members of our consortium are quite active with GFOI, such as the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. Martin Herold is part of our team, and also other members of the team as well. So we are in the planning phase of the project. As you can tell, we just started, and so re-establishing those connections is an important first step that we're going through now.
Fantastic. It could be quite challenging to also just be able to keep track of what's happening where and where it's happening. So I think it's a good way to try and ensure that you're coordinated or actually actively trying to understand the landscape. And I thank you for your presentation. This is one such opportunity for other people to be aware of that work. So thank you. I'm going to move on so we can hear from a last lightning talk. We're about 8 minutes to the end of our session. And Karel Carvet, who works for Plan for All, and he will be presenting Smart Agriculture Innovative Hub for smart agriculture capacity building in Africa.
Hello. Sorry, do you hear me now?
Yes,
do you hear me?
You.
Okay, and yes. See my screen? Okay, yes. I would like to tell you a little about Smart Afri Hub. This is some effort which is running 2 years, and generally this is related with hackathon. So there are two sides of the one activity which is related to capacity building in the Africa, and we start to design and develop this Smart Afri Hub a year ago when we ran this Nairobi Inspire Hackathon. It was virtual organizing from March till May, and on the end we had final meeting presenting the result during the IST Africa conference. So most of people, of course, participate only remotely, and only few people was on the final presentation, but we done a lot of work, and there were a number of very interesting outputs from Africa. I think if we because one topic was also Earth observation and these things, and what we recognize as the main need of people from Africa are climatic data. Yes? The most of requests was coming to the data about the climate, about the changing of the climate, and this was something what was very requested in many Afrikaans team. We continue with this development this year, and it was expected that again hackathon will be finalized in Kampala, but unfortunately due to COVID-19 we ran only remotely. You can see that this was supported by a number of organizations, including FAO, Research Data Alliance, Godan cooperate with us, and there were again number of very nice applications coming from Africa, and it was communication between people from Europe and Africa, and this Smart AfriHub was the main tool for presenting of some result. What is very interesting that people from Africa start to build their own channel for communication, and maybe that it could be important for the future. They are using WhatsApp. They established Smart AfriHub group on the WhatsApp, and this is a very active group now, and they exchange information about the conferences, about the project and other things, and seems that this type of the technology is something what could be the most useful for people in Africa. What was very interesting that people from Africa continue also now with our hackathon, which was more focused on Europe, and they came with two topics. Yes, one topic was to testing the blockchain technology for food security in Africa, and this was in the cooperation of people from Africa, India, and Europe. There were designed some first prototype for this blockchain technology, and there is big interest of people from Africa to continue with this. So we are running this on our infrastructure, and we plan to continue with this solution and with this technology. Second was focus on digitalization of indigenous knowledge in Africa, agriculture for food security, and it is interesting that among 13 challenges which was solved during this hackathon, this was awarded on second place. So it looks that people in Africa done very good work, and it was by jury assessed as something what is very useful. And we continue with the development of this tool where also people can test it, the possibility to work with Earth observation data. There is some cloud with Jupiter and other, and people also can try to publish their information or publish their own map. So this is shortly about our effort. We plan to continue with both with this Smart AfriHub, and again we plan to make big hackathon which will start from March till May, and which will run not only in Europe and Africa, but we also would like to invite South America, and if there will be interest, also Asia. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karel, for that summary. We only have 2 minutes, but I have one question for you to just briefly tell us about the blockchain challenge. Just like what was the top
the idea
that came out of that one?
The idea came from our colleague from Nairobi, and the goal was to protect information coming from farmers till the consumers, so be able to detect all changes about the information and to use this for sharing of information, but also for sharing of later selling of the product. So it was prototyping. Yes, it was very short, but we continue, and I think that the people in Africa are ready to share their experiences, and we can discuss this later, or also I can invite the colleagues from Africa what is their intention. There is also description what was done on our portal, so it could be shared if it will be interested.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Definitely, I'm definitely interested because it will be more beneficial for farmers if they can get more information and track where their products go and what the end price was. So I'm really interested.
Yep.
And with with that, I would like to thank all our speakers today for taking the time to join us. We've only got 1 minute, so I have to wrap up the session. But most importantly, I'd like to remind you all to join us for the last day tomorrow, and the first session begins at 3 p.m. Central European Time on education. Again, thanks